Hello and welcome back, and that is right, it's time to talk once again about SSD, solid state drives, and I'm going to be straight with you for the next week and a bit. It's going to get pretty SSD heavy here on the channel. Not just this channel, I would say across a lot of the tech sector, you're going to hear a lot about SSDs. Why is that? Well, three little letters, CES, Consumer Electronics Show, happening right now in Vegas. CES 2024 is going to be exceptionally SSD heavy from a lot of the big key brands. And indeed, although I'm going to talk a lot about SSDs throughout the course of the next week and a half, as I mentioned there earlier on, I will say there's a lot of similarities, a lot of crossover, and indeed a lot of drives that have already been discussed in 2023, which are now bubbling to the surface. And this video is about one that I talked about in summer 2023, the Sabrent Rocket X5 or Rocket 5 X5 or Rocket X5 Rocket Gen 5. Seriously, it's about getting the number 5 out there, isn't it? And although this isn't it, this is the Sabrent Rocket 4. This, to a point, was one of my favourite drives of the last few years. Again, they upgraded the NAND in the course of its lifetime. They're using the Phison E18 controller in the Gen 4 sector there. And the reason we've got that on the table and all of these Gen 5 entries on this side of the table is to give us some perspective on why this new Sabrent drive is making a lot of noise right now. And although there are a lot of drives being revealed at CES 2024, I will say this is one that I would argue is bubbling higher than many out there. Sabrent, you know, if you go back about 4 to 5 years, their notoriety and presence in the SSD sector was negligible. You know, the market was dominated by the big players, your Seagates, your WDs, your Samsungs, and then there was that tier underneath that were using the same proprietary hardware from the likes of Phison, from the likes of Silicon Motion, and all of those different controllers that were being worked on by third parties there, which are then being utilized by these other brands. And again, Seagate no different than those as well. But Sabrent, somehow in the Gen 4 area, absolutely exploded on the scene. And now they are gearing up in the Gen 5 sector, which has been in and ah in itself for the last 18 months. To, you know, establish itself with hardware, client, and availability of a lot of that hardware being something of a problem till now. Now, the Gen 5 drive from Sabrent there is rocking out the gate with a phenomenal performance number there, reported at a maximum 14 gigabytes per second, 14,000 megabytes per second, give or take, sequential read, and sequential write at 12,000 megabytes or 12 gigabytes there. Now, they are not the only drive in the market right now making that bold claim. Why is that? Well, as I just alluded to, other drives out there are using the same hardware. That hardware, of course, is that Phison E26 controller that has been in the market now for 2.5 years, give or take 3 at a push if you go behind closed doors. And it's kind of been the most well-trodden, well-used SSD controller for the Gen 5 market there. Again, Silicon Motion, Innodisk, they have rolled out their own alternatives, but still, Phison and that E26 has really dominated things, opening up bandwidth substantially, and in many respects, one in particular we'll touch on in a moment, opened the floodgates for the rest of the components to really stretch their muscles. Now, that controller I mentioned there has been around for about 2.5 years minimum in terms of the commercial sector, because you go back to the gigabyte drives or MSI, they were some of the earliest manufacturers to roll out Gen 5 drives. When they did, the performance they were promising was 9.5 gigabytes per second to 10 gigabytes per second. The same controller that is inside the new X5 at 14 over 12 gigabytes. How exactly in that 2 years have they opened up the bandwidth there? Well, not so much open up the bandwidth as take advantage of the available bandwidth of PCIe Gen 5 times 4. Well, a lot of that comes down to the NAND, where the data's going to live. The Micron B58R 3D TLC NAND. I'm a hoot at parties. And the actual performance numbers that are made possible by that. Now, up until relatively recently, all of those SSDs rocking out the gate with that Phison controller, the E26, have been using 1600 MTS performance or potential performance NAND there. That is mega transfers per second. That same NAND now has been rolled out with Micron's engagement with Phison to open up the floodgates for 2400 mega transfers, or MTS, per second there. The result is lots more data available down those channels, and thanks to Gen 5 supporting up to 8 TB, and therefore the distribution of the NAND across either side of the M2 NVMe inside there that all of our lovely little chips are living on inside these devices, the result is that these newer generation Phison E26 controller SSDs, like the Sabrent Rocket X5 there, I will get that name right eventually, they are able to harness the greater bandwidth and put more water down that pipe. Hence why, even though the controller inside this new Sabrent is technically the same controller from drives from 2 years ago, this drive is able to take advantage of the greater benefits in NAND. There are other advantages, and of course, firmware tweaks and improvements within that E26. But the result is the Sabrent there not only giving you that 14 over 12 gigabytes, but on top of that, allowing you to maintain that durability at 0.38 drive writes per day, and affording you and providing 1, 2, 4, and even 8 TB capacity there. Although don't be surprised if 8 TB takes a wee bit longer. Now, this drive is going to need a heatsink. Let's be realistic about this. Even if it rolls out the gate without a heatsink, which I think would be maddening, even at the Gen 4 generation of Sabrent drives, and indeed Gen 4 SSDs in general, I was already a big advocate for using heatsinks. Even if you're moving away from synthetic tests, your Atto, your crystal disk, your whatever, even in conventional utilization, the Gen 4 series of drives were still able to hit 7,000 megabytes per second, and once you do that consistently, you're going to hit high temps. That's why when we move to this side of the table, pretty much every Gen 5 SSD that we've talked about throughout the course of the last 12 months, they've all arrived with big heatsinks. Probably one of the more efficient ones we talked about was this one, the ADATA Legend, that really made a point of compacting the whole heatsink into that little chassis there, with an internal fan there inside. But of course, those fans require power. Now, other brands went another way. They didn't go with active cooling, because active cooling heatsinks, although they are of course more efficient, you're going to need available slots. You're going to need Mobos that have got the fan pins, got SATA fan pins to get those inside, or they're being put inside, more compact systems that do not have ready access. I've got customized micro ITX or mini ITX boards that do not have the pins available. So you'd have a drive like the Next Storage here, which has no active cooling, but a huge heatsink there with a copper pipe going through a too-thin design there. But then you see the more compact ones are rocking out the scene, like the Maximum or Max 14. Again, we'll be talking more about this drive later this week, arriving with a very different stylized heatsink there on board. Which brings us back to Sabrent. Now, Sabrent have already had a pretty substantial and effective heatsink at their Gen 4 generation for a number of years. This one here that we featured in other videos uses a triple copper pipe system running all the way through it, thermal padding all the way on the base and the top there inside, running all the way to a vented heat panel there at the top. Now, at the Gen 5 generation with the X5 from them, or the Rocket 5, that is pretty much the same heatsink, but now with an integrated fan within that copper piping area there and the vent all the way along the top. I cannot stress enough how important heat dissipation and active cooling is going to be a feature of Gen 5, because Gen 5 SSDs are going to not only raise the average temperature due to that distribution of NAND at those larger capacities, but also hitting those higher performance numbers are going to happen regardless of whether you try to throttle it or not. If you try to plug the drive in, the drive is obviously going to go to a capacity of performance as soon as it can. And when it does that, the temperatures are going to rise whether you like it or not. So even if you say, well, I'm only using it for my OS, I'm not doing much with it, the drive itself is still going to drive to those heights when it can. Consequently, heat sinks and heat dissipation is no longer optional. So I'm kind of glad that Sabrent are introducing this drive with that heatsink. Obviously, they're almost certainly going to go for the heat shield revision there. Maybe they're going to do maybe a QLC version or a slightly stepped down version from it. There are talks about some brands, we'll talk about this more later in the month, about some brands releasing Gen 5 times 2 M2 NVMe's, which, by the way, boggles my mind. I can't wait to talk about that on the 23rd of Jan. Stay tuned for that one. But overall, I would say the X5 from Sabrent is a very confident drive. They revealed it summer 2023. They didn't go out of their way and kind of overegg the pudding. They knew they were working on something that hadn't been released quite yet. And right now, January 2024, I think this is a more confident move forward, and alongside other 14 gigabytes per second SSDs in the Gen 5 generation being rolled out, I think now we are in a better position to enjoy the performance numbers of Gen 5 SSDs. There is still the question marks around sustained performance over time, and there are, of course, still question marks about the pricing of Gen 5, which unfortunately, versus sale and demand, has meant that Gen 5 SSD pricing is all over the shop, particularly now that we're on technically the third phase of Gen 5. It has resulted in the first two phases of those 9.5 and 10 gig SSDs having weird pricing out there, with brands having a lot of kind of players on the field that they can't really just kill off and drop the pricing on. Gen 5 SSD pricing is a bit maddening right now, but there's no denying the performance is out there, and now we are starting to see full utilization of the bandwidth that Gen 5 can afford there. When you think about the sheer range of gigabytes per second, 16 gigabytes per second is the Gen 5 times 4 full bandwidth, and now at just over 14 gig, we're kind of hitting the cap. And from this moment forward, what we're going to see in the next 6 to 12 months is Gen 5 SSDs a few extra megabytes per second, a few extra megabytes, and that's really it. So if you were holding out on Gen 5 until it was fully established, we're kind of there now, so enjoy. But apart from that, thank you so much for watching. Stay tuned for the rest of the week as we talk more about not only the other stuff from CES, but there's going to be a lot of SSD. Stay tuned for that. But apart from this, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.